In this module, we're going to be focused on poses that target the glutes. Now, other than hamstrings and the backs of the legs, the glutes are an area that so many people really want to open up. And often they're referring to them as hips. But as we know, the hips include more than just the glutes. But this is usually when we say we're going to focus on hips, or you Google hip opening poses, it's a lot of poses that will target the glute area. And this is things like pigeon or a bound ankle pose or anything that involves that external rotation. Now, when we look at the biomechanics of this glute stretch and what needs to happen and what fuels it, it is bringing the leg closer to the center point of the body, to the midline of the body. Now, this can be done with the leg straight in this capacity, or it can be done with the knee bent and again that external rotation. Now, there are certain poses that focus more on the leg being straight, such as a revolved pyramid. We can look at a revolved hand to big toe, and we look at a revolved half moon. Now, all of these poses involve this leg being straight and then the torso turning, which effectively is the same as this leg crossing the midline, but the leg stays stationary and it's the torso that brings the leg across the midline. All of those things do have an effect on creating lengthening through here. But again, most of them involve force to create flexibility. Now, the focus in this module is more on poses that involve this bent leg external rotation, not this straight leg crossing the midline here. And so for the purposes of that, I'm not going to go too deeply at all into this straight leg stuff, but what I will say is that every single one of those poses will inherently be made more sustainable, more accessible, and more personal for people if you're able to cue and guide your students into hands-free options. So for that revolved triangle, instead of bringing the body down and leaning down, you come out of it. You lift out of it. It's the same thing with this revolved hand to big toe. Don't grab. Just let that float. And same thing when we come into a revolved half moon. Lift the body away from the ground. Really find where the lift is instead of leaning the weight down onto a prop or onto the floor. Now, the focus is going to be, as I said, not on these straight leg poses, but on the external rotation coupled with the knee bent, poses like pigeon and things like that. Now, as always, we're looking at what sort of action and what activation in the body is going to help this action. So we said the action is we've got external rotation, and then we are crossing the midline in some capacity. Now, obviously, not crossing the midline does provide some opening into the glutes, but we're going to look at a little bit of both through these videos. So we've got the external rotation, a little bit of crossing of the midline. So this action is going to be fueled by the groin, the inner thigh, the hip flexor, and in certain instances, the core as well, the twist of the spine. Now, it seems that flexible hips are something that a lot of people want, and they're aware of that they have tight hips. But just because you feel that your hips aren't flexible in some capacity, or you feel that, oh, there's just such a release when I stretch them, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are strong and stable and functional. And that's why it's going to be really important for you to encourage your students and know how to guide them towards creating more stable joints. That's what we've been discussing, and specifically in relation to this, more hip stability. If we look at hip opening only through the lens of flexibility, this just does not honor the body as a holistic unit. We can't just only stretch and not have the other thing to couple it. So I know we go, oh, well, I'm going to stretch and then I'm going to strengthen. But why can't we just do it all in one go? And that's really what we're doing with all of these basic preparations that I'm going to show you, and all of these methods of figuring out, well, what's the target area? It's the glutes. What allows the glute to stretch? Well, it's crossing of the midline. What does that? It's the inner thigh. It's the hip flexor. It's, in some capacity, the core. And then those activations is what fuels the action, which is what communicates to the intended area that we want to open to willingly lengthen and stretch. A lot of times we go with these sensation-based cues, and if it feels this here, if it feels that there, while these are good and these are valuable and they do have their place, remember that just because you're not feeling something, just because a student is not feeling the stretch, doesn't mean it's not happening when we utilize the opposing and co-activation of the supporting areas of the body to help create the release through the target area. Now, as we have already explored in some of the previous videos, not only are we going to be looking at how the opposing area activating helps to communicate to the target area to let it release and have a willing lengthening, we're also going to be looking at where we can have more of a activation through the target area as well. So just because a muscle is lengthening doesn't mean it can't be strengthening. And just because a muscle is strengthening doesn't mean it can't be lengthening. The muscles are very intelligent and they are designed to perform both of these things at the same time. And we're looking again at the angle. So as long as we've got that external rotation, there's a little bit of cross of the midline, and we're playing around with these different things and these different positionings, then we know that even though we might be going into, as we're going to do with a pigeon, a resistance pigeon and an active pigeon, where we can feel that the target area is actually working, it is still lengthening. The lengthening and the strengthening will happen simultaneously, and then again, it's just about finding the right ways to offer these different variations to your students and these different ways of looking at their practice so that they can start to build a more sustainable practice and one that really does consider their body as a holistic unit. So before I get into showing you some basic preparations, again, these basic preparations can always be used to invite and prepare your students to have their bodies more willingly go into utilizing force to create flexibility if that's what you would like to guide them towards, or if that's what they want to practice, or they can be used to replace those things. The preparation is the modification. So we're going to look at some basic preparations for the glutes on the back. So single leg, you can utilize a block. Block is going to go between the heel, and instead of the back of the thigh, we're going to try and place it a little bit more towards the inner thigh so we're getting that external rotation already. Then from there, you're going to get your students to just squeeze those 2 points together, and then you're going to get them to again rotate. Now this leg, it might need to move out of the way a little bit, and then you can get them to move and oscillate into going outward and then crossing the midline. This leg might be straight outward and crossing the midline. The whole time squeezing onto here. You can also get them to go into here. You can get them to go internal rotation, neutral, external rotation, neutral. You can also get them to draw the leg towards the body. So they can go into external rotation, draw the leg towards the body, and then come back. Draw the leg in towards the body, and then come back. For a basic preparation with both legs, get your students to place the block in between the feet, having a little bit more slack on the back edge of the block. Hands can go underneath a bum or a prop if needed, and then you're going to get your students to lengthen. This can be an optional component. I like to do this. Lengthen the legs up. This is generally how I cue it. We're going to start by squeezing the block between the feet and press the legs up towards the ceiling. The legs don't have to be straight. Just start to feel into your own version of lengthening them upward. Then from there, start to slowly press the soles of your feet onto the blocks. Bend your knees. Draw the block down towards your groin and draw your knees out to the sides. Continue to squeeze onto the block the whole time. Come back the way you went into it, extending and lengthening the legs up. So that's something that you can get your students to do, because again, what we're doing is pressing the feet against the block, which activates and recruits the inner thigh. Now no, the legs are not crossing the midline, but this external rotation will instigate some opening into the glutes in some capacity via the inner thigh, the groin activation. And the other basic preparation that you can get your students to do while on their back is to come into an active cow face. So you're going to get them to cross one thigh over the other and then press the soles of the feet out to either side. Then they can come back and they can cross the other way. Press. So here we are crossing the midline, and again we are utilizing the groin, inner thighs, and those hip flexors will be involved in some capacity as well to squeeze and press, which then speaks to those glutes to have them come into a willing lengthening of the tissues. A lot of those same exercises on the back can be done from a seated position as well. Again, you can utilize the block and squeeze the block, and then you can just get your students to work on some external rotation. So yeah, we're using a lot of mobility work to be able to focus on these components that externally rotate the legs, and that's utilizing, again, that inner thigh hip flexor to be able to support the willing lengthening of the glutes. And you can do this without the block as well. It could just be a simple lift, external rotation, cross and tap, and back. Cross and tap. It could be a lift up. You could squeeze the heel in towards the outside of the leg. These are all things that will help to activate those areas to be able to speak to the glutes. And you can do some really basic preparations that are very similar from kneeling. So the one leg is going to come through, and in between I like to use blocks for these. The closer the blocks are in, then the easier it will be to get that leg through, as long as there's enough space. And then you can slide. So you can see right now my pinky toe, my outer edge of the foot, is actually lifted off the ground. However, you can also rest it down and just slide like this. There's going to be less activation there. You can also get your students to squeeze the heel in like we did from a seated position and tap, squeeze and tap. And all these things are going to be utilizing those same muscles that we want to be activated in order to speak to the willing lengthening of the target area of the glutes. When we look at some basic preparations for standing, a lot of the same things apply. So we're just going first into that external rotation. I like to cue the external rotation first, but you can also get your students to lift up and then externally rotate while the leg is lifted. And this is enough to just be here. However, when we add, as I mentioned before, a little bit of the core activation via a twist, it actually helps the leg cross the midline. So sometimes I'll get my students to bring the palms to prayer, and I'll say, bring your thumbs over towards your left armpit as you twist. At the same time, see if you can cross your left leg a little bit over towards the right, showing the sole of your left foot as much as you can to the right side of the room, while externally wrapping the left thigh open. And again, you can work on the heel in and squeeze it out and in. It could be in the twist, it could be forward, and we're just feeling into these movements. So as I did mention in one of the other videos about the balance, this can be something that you get your students to work on, squeeze and cross, and then maybe they go back and tap. All these things are utilizing our body's dynamic movement to which we wouldn't think create stretch, but as we've explored, the activation does create lengthening of the tissues. And so this is a more holistic and harmonious way that you can get the body to naturally do that for your students. All of these basic preparations are super effective in making the practice of yoga and an entry into certain asanas so much more accessible, inclusive, and sustainable. And again, the preparation is the modification, so any of those basic preparations can be utilized for any of the poses that we're about to go through in the next few videos.